This is Starry Ari's ASMR. I am Ari, and in this video, I wanted to just sit down and do kind of another little chit chat ramble video and do some hand movements on this blanket. I did a video similar to this with a different throw blanket, doing hand movements and just chit-chatting, rambling a bit, and a lot of you seem to enjoy that, so I thought I would do another one. I have this very nice soft blanket here, and it doesn't have as stark of a difference when I move my hand in one direction. You can see it a little bit. It gets a little bit darker when all of these threads are lifted, and then when I smooth it out, it gets a little bit lighter, but it's certainly not as dramatic as the other blanket because this one has a nice, almost heathered pattern. It's a lovely soft gray with lots of shades of gray and white mixed in, and it's just very soft and nice. So I think today I just want to do some hand movements on the blanket. I don't know how much of the sounds, like the fabric sounds, you're actually going to hear, but I'm hoping that the soft, gentle hand movements will be relaxing for you while I kind of ramble away. And this time, I did think about a few things that I wanted to talk about, and I kept coming back around to some of the books that I am currently reading. Now, I used to love reading when I was growing up, and then I kind of went away from it for a little while after college, and in the last year or so, I've been getting back into it and really enjoying it. And I have a few books that I think I'd like to just kind of share with you. Maybe some of the ones that I'm currently reading, some of the ones that I read maybe recently, and I think I could probably talk about some books that I would like to read in the future. So I think I will start with books that I am currently reading. And I think the main one that I'm currently reading is Contact by Carl Sagan. And I have not read this book before. And I have seen the movie with Jodie Foster, Matthew McConaughey. I think it's a great movie. But my husband has read Contact, and it's one of his favorite books. He really appreciates Carl Sagan and the perspectives on science and the field of research that he had. And I am maybe about a third of the way through the book, and I think it's really interesting. So if you don't know, Contact is, I'm trying not to give away too much, but it's basically a situation where humanity receives a signal from space, and it's kind of called the message. focuses on maybe some of the political implications, the social implications, the impacts on science and research if that were to happen. It's following one character in particular, and she is a radio astronomer, and her experience with the entire situation. And I think it's really fascinating, and I really appreciate so far Carl Sagan's, I think, his kind of due diligence writing a female character. And I think that she's a very realistic character. I think sometimes when male authors write women, it's a little cringy. But I think that he so far has done a phenomenal job. And also just pointing out, the book takes place, I think in the 90s. I think it's mid-90s. I don't recall exactly, but it might be late 80s, but kind of around that time period. And I mean, even today, the gender disparity in the sciences is quite stark. Like, generally, there tend to be more men in certain fields. And so he does bring that kind of into the story a little bit. I think it's really interesting. So I am getting through that one, and it's kind of one of those existential questions for me. If there was another intelligent civilization out in the universe, how would I react to it? So I think it's a really interesting book so far. Another one that I have been reading for a while, and I should have gotten through it by now because it's so short, but I keep picking it up and then reading something else. But it is called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses. And I believe the author is Barbara Ehrenreich. And this was a book that was published around the early 70s, I believe. And it is a look at sort of feminist history, but with this lens of women's spaces, and I think it's an interesting look at the persecution of women in the name of getting rid of witchcraft and witches, and looking at some of the trends in women being in certain fields, like being midwives throughout history. There is quite a bit of information that is a little bit dated. And overall, I think it's been an interesting read. I don't know why I haven't gotten through it, but in the field that my last job was in, I was working primarily with a lot of women, and I think that tends to be the case in what we consider helping professions. So I think reading the book through a modern lens, because this was written, early 70s, so some of the statistics are quite a bit outdated, and some of the information and theory, I think we've kind of fleshed out a little bit more, a little bit better. And I'll probably finish that soon. But I've just been kind of reading other things. I don't usually like to read too many books at once. I'm usually kind of I like to stick with one, finish that, and then move on have quite a few books that I've recently finished. Recently as in like the last few months maybe. And the first one that kind of jumps out at me that I finished quite a while ago. But it is The Stand by Stephen King. And I believe that was published originally in the late 70s. I accidentally purchased the complete and uncut version, I think is what it's called. And it was so long. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really interesting story. It kind of follows a post-apocalyptic world after a massive illness outbreak, like a massive, very quick pandemic. Having read it after the COVID pandemic, I think it's a little bit interesting, especially with this book having been written in the late 70s. But I really like Stephen King. I've read quite a few books of his, and I like his writing style. I mean, he's a very well-known author for a reason, right? But I think that was a really good read. It took me a while to get through that. And after I did finish that one, I went for a shorter, much, much shorter Stephen King book called The Body. And this is the book that the movie Stand By Me is based on. If you've seen that, it's kind of a classic. And I had not read it before, so I read that after I read The Stand because I love Stephen King's writing style, but I wanted something just much, much shorter than the complete and uncut version of The Stand. I really enjoyed that one. And it was just a fun, well, not fun, but it was an interesting coming of age story. I think that there are many Stephen King books that people still debate whether the endings were good or justified for the book or not, but I enjoyed the ending of that one. The very first book I read by Stephen King, I was probably honestly too young to, like, I maybe shouldn't have read it, but it was called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, and it's about a young, very young teen or maybe preteen girl that gets lost in the forest while she's on a hike with her family. And it's kind of this psychological thriller of her being lost in the woods and dealing with, I mean, that entire situation in general would be quite scary, but there's also kind of some spooky things happening in the woods. And a lot of the time you're not quite sure if it's actually happening or if it's in her head. So that one, I haven't read that. I mean, since, like, I think that I reread that when I was an older teen and still enjoyed it. And I wonder if I read it again now, whether I would enjoy it still. But that one, I think, kind of solidified my interest in Stephen King's writing style, and it's not even considered like one of his better books, so that's kind of, I don't know, maybe in the future I'll give that one a read again. I also finished 1984 by George Orwell, which I think is interesting, and I think that 1984 was kind of not based on, or I think that inspired by like a separate Russian story that was similar. And I've never read the translated version of that, and honestly, I can't even remember what it's called, but I still think that 1984 is a really interesting read. I honestly feel like everyone could benefit from reading it. I think that it's really important to read things and engage with topics and materials that might be challenging, or even maybe things that you disagree with. I think that that's really important, and I think that we become better people when we're challenged. And we have to think about our thought processes and the way we view society. I think that those are all really important things, but I also think that's maybe my sociologist brain talking. I'm kind of a sucker for like apocalyptic storylines or dystopian storylines. I think that they're interesting. Maybe that says something about me. I don't know. Another one that I recently finished, which was actually my last book that I just finished, and it is called The Once and Future Witches. And this book was written by an author named Alex E. Harrow, I think. Pretty sure. And I think that she wrote this book and published it in 2020, so fairly recently. And it is a fiction, it's a historical fiction based around the women's suffragette movement, and it takes place in New Salem, Massachusetts. And it's kind of a book about three sisters finding the will and the ways of witchcraft. So this is a historical fiction in which witchcraft was real and the persecution of witches happened. The characters were pretty fun too. I think that I had a very clear image of each character, the main characters. So I really liked the writing style of that. And I found some aspects of the very end of the book really fascinating, and I love when you read a book and you finally get to the end and you're like, oh, like that makes so much sense. Or like, oh duh, like how did I not see that? And this one kind of had an element of that, so I enjoyed that. There was also a quote in that book, and it was by one of the characters. And because it's kind of focused around the women's rights movement, there's a lot of those kind of similar themes. And there was a quote, and it's easy to ignore a woman, but a hell of a lot harder to ignore a witch. Again, I think as an independent, outspoken woman, seeing how women throughout history that were frequently outspoken or going against societal norms were ostracized. I did enjoy that book. I feel like there were some parts early on that kind of dragged on for me, but it got interesting pretty quick. quite a while ago now. I think it was back in the fall. I reread The Giver by Lois Lowry, and I actually listened to it as an audiobook. My husband and I listened to it together. We would just kind of turn it on as we were doing stuff around the house. And he hadn't read it before. I had read it in school and hadn't read it since. I think reading it as an adult and having some new perspectives on society, of course, quite different than a young teen. It was really fun listening to it with my husband because after each chapter, or whenever we were done listening for the day, we would kind of like chit chat about what happened and some of the themes we were seeing, maybe some societal themes that are present in real life. And I recommend at least reading that one once if you haven't before. I think there are some sections that are pretty heavy-handed that maybe could have used a lighter touch, but overall, I think a really interesting story. I think that one also has a movie adaptation, but I don't recall if I've seen it or if it was generally regarded well. So I'm not too sure. And I do have a few things that I really want to read. And one of them is a book that I have not read before. I would really like to read The Story of My Life by Helen Keller. So I've not read that before. I would also really like to read the full Hitchhiker's Guide series. I've never read the full series, and in my book show and tell video, I had mentioned that we are trying to recollect the full series because my husband had it at one point, and then as we moved, it generally, I think we ended up getting rid of some books, and I'm so sad that we did that as stupid young college students. But we're trying to like thrift books that we find interesting, so we're kind of keeping an eye out for that. But we do have the first one, so I think that I would like to reread that at some point and then find the other books. I know I've talked a lot about Stephen King so far, but another one, which I think is like an absolute classic of his that I have never read, and that is Salem's Lot. And I think that I would enjoy it, and I don't know why I've never read it, but I would like to read that at some point. One that I've been kind of floating recently that I'm not too sure if I want to read it, which I think tells me that I should, and that is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I know it is a difficult topic and a difficult read, but I think that culturally it, I think, would be good for me to read. And I have seen the show. I didn't finish all of it, but it was certainly one of those stories that is just heavy and like gut punch after gut punch. But I would really like to read the book I know that there are quite a few different takes on things, as there always kind of will be between movies and shows that are adapted from a book. I think that I'll probably get myself to read that one at some point. I have seen on, I think it's like the book recommendations subreddit or something like that, that there was a thread about like feel good books, and I was kind of scoping that thread because I think that it's really important to be challenged and read things that might be difficult, but I think it's good to have maybe some easier reads that don't put you in such a sad, depressed state. And there was one, and I think it was called something like The People of Platform 5 or The People on Platform 5, something like that. And it was kind of this take of like what if strangers talked to each other, like that idea. And it seemed like a lot of people were recommending that one and enjoyed that one, so I'll probably give that one at least a look and see if it seems like something that I would enjoy. I do read a lot on my Nook. I like having a physical book more, but it's just kind of more convenient having my Nook, and when we're traveling, I can just bring that, like throw it in my bag, and it's small enough, and it's just really convenient that it can carry a ton of books. Well, I think I will leave it at that. I hope that you enjoyed listening to me ramble a little bit about some of the books that I've been reading, some of the books that I want to read. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest